Yeah, sloppy turbos can make one heck of a mess. That's why when they start to get sloppy like this, you should go ahead and repair them. Most of the time it's acceptable until they get close to touching the housing or start leaking oil. So we're not actually doing a rebuild on our turbo today. We're technically doing an overhaul because a rebuild means replacing any part that can wear, where an overhaul means just going in and replacing the parts that are worn. I got a kit here. It has all the bearings, bushings, and seals needed for this turbo. I've rebuilt a couple of these turbos previously in the past with this same kit and have yet to have any issues. So number one is just kind of unsealing this turbo. This one has been sitting in storage for a while. I managed to wreck a few turbos, obviously, because I take boost pretty seriously.
I need NOS.
And I put a lot of miles on my trucks, so obviously I've had to do a couple of these before. Not a problem with them at all. It just happens to be that I drive them that much. This turbo is starting to get more loose than your mom, though, so it's definitely time for it to get freshened up. Here we got all the new seals, lock rings, bolts, hardware, bushings, bearings, everything you need, any part you might need to replace. So you just kind of got to make sure when you purchase the kits that it's for the turbo you're planning on rebuilding. I've taken quite a number of these VGT turbos apart, so you just kind of have to figure out the orientation that everything goes back together, so that way it's easier on reassembly. So I'm just marking the position of where the exhaust housing and the intake housing line up on this turbo, just so that way when I assemble and put the halves back together, I just can line it up easily. This makes it a lot quicker when it comes time to reassemble. You can mark the clamp too, and yeah, really any other part that needs to be lined up a certain way, just so that way when you put it back together, it just takes one try to line everything up. A couple light tappity taps from the hammer always seems to separate the halves of the turbo pretty easily. The compressor wheel is reverse thread, so righty loosey, lefty tighty. Remember that, don't go and snap the frickin' shaft in half. Make sure when taking these apart, you take a good look at the orientation that all the bearings go on the main shaft. So that way when you put it back together, you can kind of figure out how everything goes. If needed, maybe just take some photos of what it looks like coming apart, so that way when putting it back together, you know. Right next to the exhaust turbine here is the oil ring. That's what seals the oil on the exhaust side of the turbo. There's one on the intake side of the turbo too, so make sure to pull those off and replace both of those and inspect that the surface they ride on is in clean condition. Alright, now everything is pulled apart, so the next step is really just to clean all the pieces. Just make sure everything's clean before reassembly. Look at that, all the parts have been cleaned and degreased, very important steps, so that way everything can go together without any contaminants and kind of keep the rust off of things, keep any dirt getting into anywhere. Just clean it up. It's worth it, 100%. Now we're going to want to take a look at all the parts we removed from the turbo to replace, and all the new parts that came in the kit. We're going to compare all the sizes, make sure there's a replacement for each of them, and kind of figure out where everything goes. So that way we know that all the parts we got to replace it are the right size for the kit, all the oil rings are the right size, and the hardware is all the right thread. So here I'm just making sure the main bushings for this are a different length, but the center sleeve is actually longer. So stacked together here, you can see they're the same length and all, so they'll fit just fine. And then this here thrust washer is actually different from the old one. But I can just see in the compressor housing that it actually fits in there nice and snug, so it's not going to be a problem. It is the right one for the kit. Lube all of the parts during assembly. I don't care if it's using grease, engine oil, assembly lube. Here I'm just using this oil supplement. It's just what I have. It's nice and thick, so it sticks to all the parts well. Lubricate all the bearings and seals when assembling. Very important part, do not forget.
What do you think Becca's gonna be psyched that you brought a bottle of lube?
Torque these bolts down. I think they were like 12 foot-pounds. I'm not sure. Just go ahead and double check. Get a torque spec list when you go to do a turbo. We all know what this thing is.
That's a tranquilizer gun.
Honestly, getting all these vanes lined up when putting the unison ring back on is actually about the worst part of tearing one of these turbos apart. Little way to make it easier, just get them all in line, put the ring on top, and move them one at a time until the ring falls down. And see, I'm just making sure here that the ring moves back and forth nicely. Those marks I mentioned putting in earlier are coming in handy right now with lining the turbo up. Do not go light on this clamp. It needs to be very, very tight, otherwise your turbo will leak. Most people don't use a torque wrench when assembling stuff, but use a frickin' torque wrench. That way if it falls apart, you can't pretend you didn't do anything about it. Tightening something up by hand until it's snug does work, but it's not a torque spec. Okay, so this VGT solenoid, make sure you lube that thing up very well and check that all the O-rings are in good condition, well lubricated, and just slam her in there till she hits bottom. Pretty simple. A couple mini Ugga-Duggas also works pretty good as a torque spec. There we go, nice and tight. Yeah, there should be a little bit of resistance after rebuilding, but you should be able to turn the turbine around nicely by hand without having any issues. Just put an exhaust freaking shield thing back on there. I don't really see a point in those, but it's on there, so I put it back on, and a little clip here for the harness. But yeah, there we go. You can wipe it up nice and clean. There's a fully rebuilt turbo, probably good for another couple 100,000 kilometers. It'll definitely outlive the 6-liter if you rebuild it once. Make sure you put a good gasket on and don't let any dirt get in there, and yeah, it'll outlive the engine.